Antony and Cleopatra is a tragedy by William Shakespeare. The play was performed first circa 1607 at the Blackfriars Theatre or the Globe Theatre by the King's Men. Its first appearance in print was in the folio of 1623. The plot is based on Thomas North's translation of Plutarch's Lives and follows the relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony from the time of the Sicilian Revolt to Cleopatra's suicide during the final war of the Roman Republic. The major antagonist is Octavius Caesar, one of Antony's fellow triumvirs of the Second Triumvirate and the first emperor of the Roman Empire. The tragedy is mainly set in Roman Egypt, and is characterized by swift shifts in geographical location and linguistic register as it alternates between sensual, imaginative Alexandria and a more pragmatic, austere Rome. Many consider Shakespeare's Cleopatra, whom Antony describes as having infinite variety, as one of the most complex and fully developed female characters in the playwright's body of work. She is frequently vain and histrionic enough to provoke an audience almost to scorn. At the same time, Shakespeare invests her and Antony with tragic grandeur. These contradictory features have led to famously divided critical responses. It is difficult to classify Antony and Cleopatra as belonging to a single genre. It can be described as a history play, though it does not completely adhere to historical accounts. As a tragedy, though not completely in Aristotelian terms. As a comedy, as a romance, and according to some critics, e.g. McCarter, a problem play. All one can say with certainty is that it is a Roman play, even a sequel to another of Shakespeare's tragedies, Julius Caesar. Characters: Mark Antony, Roman general and one of the three joint leaders, or triumvirs, who ruled the Roman Republic after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 B.C. Synopsis: Mark Antony, one of the triumvirs of the Roman Republic, along with Octavius and Lepidus, has neglected his soldierly duties after being beguiled by Egypt's queen, Cleopatra. He ignores Rome's domestic problems, including the fact that his third wife Fulvia rebelled against Octavius and then died. Octavius calls Antony back to Rome from Alexandria to help him fight against Sextus Pompey, Menecrates, and Menes, three notorious pirates of the Mediterranean. At Alexandria, Cleopatra begs Antony not to go, and though he repeatedly affirms his deep passionate love for her, he eventually leaves. The triumvirs meet in Rome, where Antony and Octavius put to rest, for now, their disagreements. Octavius's general, Agrippa, suggests that Antony should marry Octavius's sister, Octavia, in order to cement the friendly bond between the two men. Antony accepts. Antony's lieutenant Barbus, though, knows that Octavia can never satisfy him after Cleopatra. In a famous passage, he describes Cleopatra's charms. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed, but she makes hungry where most she satisfies. Quote, in Egypt, Cleopatra learns of Antony's marriage to Octavia and takes furious revenge upon the messenger that brings her the news. She grows content only when her courtiers assure her that Octavia is homely, short, low-browed, round-faced and with bad hair. Before battle, the triumvirs parley with Sextus Pompey, and offer him a truce. He can retain Sicily and Sardinia, but he must help them rid the sea of pirates and send them tributes. After some hesitation, Sextus agrees. They engage in a drunken celebration on Sextus' galley. Though the austere Octavius leaves early and sober from the party, Menes suggests to Sextus that he kill the three triumvirs and make himself ruler of the Roman Republic, but he refuses, finding it dishonorable. After Antony departs Rome for Athens, Octavius and Lepidus break their truce with Sextus and war against him. This is unapproved by Antony, and he is furious. Antony returns to Alexandria and crowns Cleopatra and himself as rulers of Egypt and the eastern third of the Roman Republic, which was Antony's share as one of the triumvirs. He accuses Octavius of not giving him his fair share of Sextus' lands, and is angry that Lepidus, whom Octavius has imprisoned, is out of the triumvirate. Octavius agrees to the former demand, but otherwise is very displeased with what Antony has done. In this Baroque vision, Battle of Actium by Lorenzo Castro, Cleopatra flees, lower left, in a barge with a figurehead of Fortuna. Antony prepares to battle Octavius. Enobarbus urges Antony to fight on land, where he has the advantage, instead of by sea, where the navy of Octavius is lighter, more mobile and better manned. Antony refuses, since Octavius has dared him to fight at sea. Cleopatra pledges her fleet to aid Antony. However, during the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece, Cleopatra flees with her 60 ships, and Antony follows her, leaving his forces to ruin. Ashamed of what he has done for the love of Cleopatra, Antony reproaches her for making him a coward, but also sets this true and deep love above all else, saying, "Give me a kiss. Even this repays me." Quote, Octavius sends a messenger to ask Cleopatra to give up Antony and come over to his side. She hesitates, and flirts with the messenger. When Antony walks in and angrily denounces her behavior, he sends the messenger to be whipped. Eventually, he forgives Cleopatra and pledges to fight another battle for her, this time on land. On the eve of the battle, Antony's soldiers hear strange portents, which they interpret as the god Hercules abandoning his protection of Antony. Furthermore, Enobarbus, Antony's long-serving lieutenant, deserts him and goes over to Octavius's side, rather than confiscating Enobarbus' goods, which Enobarbus did not take with him when he fled. Antony orders them to be sent to Enobarbus. Enobarbus is so overwhelmed by Antony's generosity, and so ashamed of his own disloyalty, that he dies from a broken heart. Antony loses the battle as his troops desert en masse, and he denounces Cleopatra. "This foul Egyptian hath betrayed me." Quote, he resolves to kill her for the treachery. Cleopatra decides that the only way to win back Antony's love is to send him word that she killed herself, dying with his name on her lips. She locks herself in her monument, and awaits Antony's return. Her plan fails. Rather than rushing back in remorse to see the dead Cleopatra, Antony decides that his own life is no longer worth living. He begs one of his aides, Eros, to run him through with a sword, but Eros cannot bear to do it and kills himself. Antony admires Eros' courage and attempts to do the same, but only succeeds in wounding himself. In great pain, he learns that Cleopatra is indeed alive. He is hoisted up to her in her monument and dies in her arms. Octavius goes to Cleopatra trying to persuade her to surrender. She angrily refuses, since she can imagine nothing worse than being led in chains through the streets of Rome, proclaimed a villain for the ages. She imagines that the quick comedians, extemporally, will stage us and present our Alexandrian revels. Antony shall be brought drunken forth, and I shall see some squeaking Cleopatra boy my greatness, ith posture of a whore. Quote, this speech is full of dramatic irony, because in Shakespeare's time Cleopatra really was played by a squeaking boy, and Shakespeare's play does depict Antony's drunken revels. Cleopatra is betrayed and taken into custody by the Romans. She gives Octavius what she claims is a complete account of her wealth, but is betrayed by her treasurer, who claims she is holding treasure back. Octavius reassures her that he is not interested in her wealth, but Dolabella warns her that he intends to parade her at his triumph. Cleopatra kills herself using the poison of an asp. She dies calmly and ecstatically. imagining how she will meet Antony again in the afterlife. Her serving maids, Iris and Charmaine, die also, with Iris dying from heartbreak and Charmaine killing herself with another asp. Octavius discovers the dead bodies and experiences conflicting emotions. Antony's and Cleopatra's deaths leave him free to become the first Roman emperor, but he also feels some kind of sympathy for them. She shall be buried by her Antony. No grave upon the earth shall clip in it a pair so famous. Quote, he orders a public military funeral. Date and text. The first page of Antony and Cleopatra from the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, published in 1623. Many scholars believe it was written in 1606–07. Modern editions divide the play into a conventional 5-act structure, but as in most of his earlier plays, Shakespeare did not create these act divisions. His play is articulated in 40 separate scenes, more than he used for any other play. Even the word "scenes" may be inappropriate as a description, as the scene changes are often very fluid, almost montage-like. The large number of scenes is necessary because the action frequently switches between Alexandria, Italy, Messina and Sicily, Syria, Athens and other parts of Egypt and the Roman Republic. The play contains 34 speaking characters, fairly typical for a Shakespeare play on such an epic scale. Analysis and criticism. Classical allusions and analogues, Dido and Aeneas from Virgil's Aeneid. Many critics have noted the strong influence of Virgil's first-century Roman epic poem, the Aeneid, on Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Such influence should be expected, given the prevalence of allusions to Virgil in the Renaissance culture in which Shakespeare was educated. Moreover, as is well known, the historical Antony and Cleopatra were the prototypes and antitypes for Virgil's Dido and Aeneas. Dido, ruler of the North African city of Carthage, tempts Aeneas, the legendary exemplar of Roman pietas, to forego his task of founding Rome after the fall of Troy. The fictional Aeneas dutifully resists Dido's temptation and abandons her to forge on to Italy, placing political destiny before romantic love, in stark contrast to Antony, who puts passionate love of his own Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, before duty to Rome. This politically charged dream vision is just one example of the way that Shakespeare's story destabilizes and potentially critiques the Roman ideology inherited from Virgil's epic and embodied in the mythic Roman ancestor Aeneas. Critical history, changing views of Cleopatra. Cleopatra, being the complex figure that she is, has faced a variety of interpretations of character throughout history. Perhaps the most famous dichotomy is that of the manipulative seductress versus the skilled leader. Examining the critical history of the character of Cleopatra reveals that intellectuals of the 19th century and the early 20th century viewed her as merely an object of sexuality that could be understood and diminished rather than an imposing force with great poise and capacity for leadership. This phenomenon is illustrated by the famous poet T.S. Eliot's take on Cleopatra. He saw her as no wielder of power, but rather that her devouring sexuality diminishes her power. His language and writings use images of darkness, desire, beauty, sensuality, and carnality to portray not a strong, powerful woman, but a temptress. Throughout his writing on Antony and Cleopatra, Eliot refers to Cleopatra as material rather than person. He frequently calls her thing. T.S. Eliot conveys the view of early critical history on the character of Cleopatra. Other scholars also discuss early critics' views of Cleopatra in relation to a serpent signifying original sin, p. 13. The serpent, because it represents temptation, sin, and feminine weakness, is used by 19th and early 20th century critics to undermine Cleopatra's political authority and to emphasize the image of Cleopatra as manipulative seductress. The postmodern view of Cleopatra is complex. Doris Adler suggests that, in a postmodern philosophical sense, we cannot begin to grasp the character of Cleopatra because, in a sense, it is a distortion to consider Cleopatra at any moment apart from the entire cultural milieu that creates and consumes Antony and Cleopatra on stage. However, the isolation and microscopic examination of a single aspect apart from its host environment is an effort to improve the understanding of the broader context. In similar fashion, the isolation and examination of the stage image of Cleopatra becomes an attempt to improve the understanding of the theatrical power of her infinite variety and the cultural treatment of that power. Quote, some postmodern critics also believe that the view of Cleopatra is constantly shifting and can be interpreted in many new and sometimes exciting ways. Francesca T. Royster suggests that contemporary interpretations of Cleopatra consider her African-American traits. Cleopatra has soul. She provides the proof that there is a locatable black aesthetic transcendent of time and place. Quote, these constant shifts in the perception of Cleopatra are well represented in a review of Estelle Parsons' adaptation of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra at the Barber Theatre in New York City. Arthur Homburg surmises, what had at first seemed like a desperate attempt to be chic in a trendy New York manner was, in fact, an ingenious way to characterize the differences between Antony's Rome and Cleopatra's Egypt. Most productions rely on rather predictable contrasts in costuming to imply the rigid discipline of the former and the languid self-indulgence of the latter. By exploiting ethnic differences in speech, gesture, and movement, Parsons rendered the clash between two opposing cultures not only contemporary but also poignant. In this setting, the white Egyptians represented a graceful and ancient aristocracy, well-groomed, elegantly poised, and doomed. The Romans, upstarts from the West, lacked finesse and polish, but by sheer brute strength they would hold dominion over principalities and kingdoms. Quote, this assessment of the changing way in which Cleopatra is represented in modern adaptations of Shakespeare's play is yet another example of how the modern and postmodern view of Cleopatra is constantly evolving. Cleopatra is a difficult character to pin down because there are multiple aspects of her personality that we occasionally get a glimpse of. However, the most dominant parts of her character seem to oscillate between a powerful ruler, a seductress, and a heroine of sorts. Power is one of Cleopatra's most dominant character traits and she uses it as a means of control. This thirst for control manifested itself through Cleopatra's initial seduction of Antony, in which she was dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and made quite a calculated entrance in order to capture his attention. She was an autonomous and confident ruler, sending a powerful message about the independence and strength of women. Cleopatra had quite a wide influence, and still continues to inspire, making her a heroine to many. Structure, Egypt and Rome. The relationship between Egypt and Rome in Antony and Cleopatra is central to understanding the plot, as the dichotomy allows the reader to gain more insight into the characters, their relationships, and the ongoing events that occur throughout the play. Shakespeare emphasizes the differences between the two nations with his use of language and literary devices, which also highlight the different characterizations of the two countries by their own inhabitants and visitors. Literary critics have also spent many years developing arguments concerning the masculinity of Rome and the Romans and the femininity of Egypt and the Egyptians. In traditional criticism of Antony and Cleopatra, Rome has been characterized as a male world, presided over by the austere Caesar, and Egypt as a female domain, embodied by a Cleopatra who is seen to be as abundant, leaky, and changeable as the Nile. literary devices used to convey the differences between Rome and Egypt. For Rome to melt is for it to lose its defining shape, the boundary that contains its civic and military codes. In her article, Roman World, Egyptian Earth, critic Mary Thomas Crane introduces another symbol throughout the play: the four elements. In general, characters associated with Egypt perceive their world composed of the Aristotelian elements, which are earth, wind, fire and water. For Aristotle, these physical elements were the center of the universe, and appropriately Cleopatra heralds her coming death when she proclaims, "I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life." Quote, thus this reflects the difference between the Egyptians, who are interconnected with the elemental earth, and the Romans in their dominating the hard-surfaced, impervious world. Critics also suggest that the political attitudes of the main characters are an allegory for the political atmosphere of Shakespeare's time. According to Paul Lawrence Rose in his article, The Politics of Antony and Cleopatra, the views expressed in the play of national solidarity, social order and strong rule. The characterization of Rome and Egypt. Critics have often used the opposition between Rome and Egypt in Antony and Cleopatra to set forth defining characteristics of the various characters. While some characters are distinctly Egyptian, others are distinctly Roman, some are torn between the two, and still others attempt to remain neutral. p. 175. Rome from the Roman perspective. According to Hirsch, Rome largely defines itself by its opposition to Egypt, and that they are not to be influenced and controlled by the world but vice versa. Rome from the Egyptian perspective. The Egyptians view the Romans as boring, oppressive, strict and lacking in passion and creativity, preferring strict rules and regulations. p. 177. Egypt from the Egyptian perspective. The Egyptian worldview reflects what Mary Floyd Wilson has called geohumoralism, or the belief that climate and other environmental factors shapes racial character. Fed by the dung, the beggar's nurse and Caesars. They view life as more fluid and less structured, allowing for creativity and passionate pursuits. Egypt from the Roman perspective. The Romans view the Egyptians essentially as improper. Their passion for life is continuously viewed as irresponsible, indulgent, over-sexualized and disorderly. p. 176. 77. The Romans view Egypt as a distraction that can send even the best men off course. This is demonstrated in the following passage describing Antony. Ultimately, the dichotomy between Rome and Egypt is used to distinguish two sets of conflicting values between two different locales. Yet, it goes beyond this division to show the conflicting sets of values not only between two cultures, but within cultures, even within individuals. While some characters fall completely into the category of Roman or Egyptian, others, such as Antony, cannot choose between the two conflicting locales and cultures. Instead, he oscillates between the two. In the beginning of the play, Cleopatra calls attention to this, saying, "This shows Antony's willingness to embrace the pleasures of Egyptian life, yet his tendency to still be drawn back into Roman thoughts and ideas." Orientalism plays a very specific, and yet nuanced role in the story of Antony and Cleopatra. A more specific term comes to mind from Richmond Barber, that of Proto-Orientalism. That is Orientalism before the age of imperialism. The changing views of critics regarding gender characterization of Egypt and Rome. Feminist criticism of Antony and Cleopatra has provided a more in-depth reading of the play, has challenged previous norms for criticism, and has opened a larger discussion of the characterization of Egypt and Rome. However, as Gail Green so aptly recognizes, it must be addressed that feminist criticism. Feminist scholars, in respect to Antony and Cleopatra, often examine Shakespeare's use of language when describing Rome and Egypt. Through his language, such scholars argue, He tends to characterize Rome as masculine and Egypt as feminine. Quote, according to Gail Green, the feminine world of love and personal relationships is secondary to the masculine world of war and politics. The highlighting of these starkly contrasting qualities of the two backdrops of Antony and Cleopatra, in both Shakespeare's language and the words of critics, brings attention to the characterization of the title characters, since their respective countries are meant to represent and emphasize their attributes. The feminine categorization of Egypt, and subsequently Cleopatra, was negatively portrayed throughout early criticism. The story of Antony and Cleopatra was often summarized as either the fall of a great general, betrayed in his dotage by a treacherous strumpet, or else it can be viewed as a celebration of transcendental love. Quote, p. 297. In both reduced summaries, Egypt and Cleopatra are presented as either the destruction of Antony's masculinity and greatness, or as agents in a love story. Once the women's liberation movement grew between the 1960s and 1980s, however, critics began to take a closer look at both Shakespeare's characterization of Egypt and Cleopatra, and the work and opinions of other critics on the same matter. Jonathan Gill Harris claims that the Egypt versus Rome dichotomy many critics often adopt does not only represent a gender polarity, but also a gender hierarchy. Egypt and Cleopatra are both represented by Brandes as uncontrollable because of their connection with the Nile River and Cleopatra's infinite variety. L.T. Fitz outwardly claims that early criticism of Antony and Cleopatra is colored by the sexist assumptions the critics have brought with them to their reading. Quote, p. 310. These criticisms are only a few examples of how the critical views of Egypt's femininity and Rome's masculinity have changed over time, and how the development of feminist theory has helped in widening the discussion. Themes and motifs. Ambiguity and opposition. Relativity and ambiguity are prominent ideas in the play, and the audience is challenged to come to conclusions about the ambivalent nature of many of the characters. The relationship between Antony and Cleopatra can easily be read as one of love or lust. Their passion can be construed as being wholly destructive, but also showing elements of transcendence. Cleopatra might be said to kill herself out of love for Antony, or because she has lost political power. p. 127. Octavius can be seen as either a noble and good ruler, only wanting what is right for Rome, or as a cruel and ruthless politician. Theme of ambivalence. However, he then strangely says to Cleopatra, "All that is won and lost. Give me a kiss. Even this repays me." Betrayal. Shakespeare critic Sarah Dietz says Cleopatra's betrayal fell on the successful fencing with Octavius that leaves her to be noble too, even though loyalty is central to secure alliances. Shakespeare is making a point with the theme of betrayal by exposing how people in power cannot be trusted, no matter how honest their word may seem. The characters' loyalty and validity of promises are constantly called into question. The perpetual swaying between alliances strengthens the ambiguity and uncertainty amid the characters' loyalty and disloyalty. Power dynamics. Cleopatra's character is slightly unpinnable, as her character identity retains a certain aspect of mystery. She embodies the mystical, exotic, and dangerous nature of Egypt as the serpent of Old Nile. She is continually described in an unearthly nature, which extends to her description as the goddess Venus. This mysteriousness attached with the supernatural not only captures the audience and Antony, but also draws all other characters' focus. As a center of conversation when not present in the scene, Cleopatra is continually a central point, therefore demanding the control of the stage. Manipulation and the quest for power are very prominent themes not only in the play but specifically in the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra. Both utilize language to undermine the power of the other and to heighten their own sense of power. Cleopatra uses language to undermine Antony's assumed authority over her. Cleopatra's Roman language of command works to undermine Antony's authority. Quote, in this case Cleopatra speaks in an authoritative and affirming sense to her lover, which to Shakespeare's audience would be uncharacteristic for a female lover. Antony's language suggests his struggle for power against Cleopatra's dominion. Antony's obsessive language concerned with structure, organization, and maintenance for the self and empire, and repeated references to measure, property, and rule express unconscious anxieties about boundary integrity and violation. Quote, Hooks 38. Antony feels restrained by Egyptian fetters, indicating that he recognizes Cleopatra's control over him. He also mentions losing himself in dotage. Himself referring to Antony as Roman ruler and authority over people including Cleopatra. Cleopatra also succeeds in causing Antony to speak in a more theatrical sense and therefore undermine his own true authority. In Act 1, Scene 1, Antony not only speaks again of his empire but constructs a theatrical image. Let Rome and Tiber melt, and the wide arch of the ranged empire fall. The nobleness of life is to do thus. When such a mutual pair, in such a twain can dot, in which I bind, on pain of punishment, the world to weet, we stand up peerless. Cleopatra immediately says, excellent falsehood, in an aside, indicating to the audience that she intends for Antony to adopt this rhetoric. Yachnan's article focuses on Cleopatra's usurping of Antony's authority through her own and his language, while Hooke's article gives weight to Antony's attempts to assert his authority through rhetoric. Both articles indicate the lovers' awareness of each other's quests for power. Despite awareness and the political power struggle existent in the play, Antony and Cleopatra both fail to achieve their goals by the play's conclusion. Performing gender and cross-dressing. Antony and Cleopatra is essentially a male-dominated play in which the character of Cleopatra takes significance as one of few female figures and definitely the only strong female character. As Oriana Palashi says in her article, when boys or women tell their dreams, Cleopatra and the boy actor. Cleopatra constantly occupies the center, if not of the stage, certainly of the discourse, often charged with sexual innuendos and disparaging tirades of the male Roman world. We see the significance of this figure by the constant mention of her, even when she is not on stage. What is said about Cleopatra is not always what one would normally say about a ruler. The image that is created makes the audience expect to see on stage not a noble sovereign, but a dark, dangerous, evil, sensual and lewd creature who has harnessed the captain's heart. p. 210. The constant comments of the Romans about Cleopatra often undermine her, representing the Roman thought on the foreign and particularly of Egyptians. From the perspective of the reason-driven Romans, Shakespeare's Egyptian queen repeatedly violates the rules of decorum. p. 210. It is no wonder, then, that she is such a subordinated queen. And yet she is also shown as having real power in the play. When threatened to be made a fool and fully overpowered by Octavius, she takes her own life. She is not to be silenced by the new master. She is the one who will silence herself. My resolution and my hands I'll trust, none about Caesar. IV. 15, 51, 52. Quote, p. 606, 607. From this, connections can be made between power and the performance of the female role as portrayed by Cleopatra. Such a Saturnalian exchange of costumes in the opening scene would have opened up a number of important perspectives for the play's original audience. It would immediately have established the sportiveness of the lovers. It would have provided a specific theatrical context for Cleopatra's later reminiscence about another occasion on which she put my tires and mandals on him, whilst I wore his sword. Philippine 2 v. 22-23. It would have prepared the ground for Cleopatra's subsequent insistence on appearing, for a man, 3 v. 18, to bear a charge in the war. In doing so, it would also have prepared the audience for Antony's demeaning acquiescence in her usurpation of the male role. If Shakespeare had indeed intended for Antony to cross-dress, it would have drawn even more similarities between Antony and Hercules, a comparison that many scholars have noted many times before. p. 65. However, it has been noted that, while women dressing as men, i.e., a boy actor acting a female character who dresses as a man, are common in Shakespeare, the reverse, i.e., a male adult actor dressing as a woman, is all but non-existent, leaving aside Antony's debated case. Antony and Cleopatra also contains self-references to the cross-dressing as it would have been performed historically on the London stage. For instance, in Act 5, Scene 2, Cleopatra exclaims, "Antony shall be brought drunken forth, and I shall see some squeaking Cleopatra boy my greatness, ith posture of a whore." L. 214-217. Many scholars interpret these lines as a metatheatrical reference to Shakespeare's own production, and by doing so comments on his own stage. Shakespeare critics such as Tracy Seidinger interpret this as Shakespeare's critique of the London stage, which, by the perpetuation of boy actors playing the part of the woman, serves to establish the superiority of the male spectator's sexuality. p. 64. What is being argued here is that the cross-dressing on the London stage challenges the dominant epistemology of Elizabethan society that associated sight with knowledge. The boy actors portraying female sexuality on the London stage contradicted such a simple ontology. Critics such as Racken interpret Shakespeare's metatheatrical references to the cross-dressing on stage with less concern for societal elements and more of a focus on the dramatic ramifications. Racken argues in her article on Shakespeare's Boy Cleopatra that Shakespeare manipulates the cross-dressing to highlight a motif of the play, recklessness, which is discussed in the article as the recurring elements of acting without properly considering the consequences. Racken cites the same quote, "Antony shall be brought drunken forth, and I shall see some squeaking Cleopatra boy my greatness, ith posture of a whore," to make the argument that here the audience is reminded of the very same treatment Cleopatra is receiving on Shakespeare's stage, since she is being portrayed by a boy actor. v. E. 214-217. Shakespeare, utilizing the metatheatrical reference to his own stage, perpetuates his motif of recklessness by purposefully shattering the audience's acceptance of the dramatic illusion. p. 201. Other critics argue that the cross-dressing as it occurs in the play is less of a mere convention, and more of an embodiment of dominant power structures. Critics such as Charles Forker argue that the boy actors were a result of what we may call androgyny. p. 10. Essentially, the cross-dressing occurs as a result of the patriarchally structured society. Empire. Sexuality and empire. The textual motif of empire within Antony and Cleopatra has strong gendered and erotic undercurrents. Antony, the Roman soldier characterized by a certain effeminacy, is the main article of conquest, falling first to Cleopatra and then to Caesar. Cleopatra's triumph over her lover is attested to by Caesar himself, who gives that Antony is not more manlike than Cleopatra, nor the Queen of Ptolemy more womanly than he. That Cleopatra takes on the role of male aggressor in her relationship with Antony should not be surprising. After all, a culture attempting to dominate another culture will, having failed to perform Roman masculinity and virtue, Antony's only means with which he might write himself into Rome's imperial narrative and position himself at the birth of empire, is to cast himself in the feminine archetype of the sacrificial virgin. Once Caesar says of her final deed, bravest at the last, she leveled at our purposes, and, being royal, took her own way. Arthur L. Little, in agitative fashion, suggests that the desire to overcome the queen has a corporeal connotation. If a black, read foreign, man raping a white woman encapsulates an iconographic truth of the dominant society's sexual, racial, national, and imperial fears, a white man raping a black woman becomes the evidentiary playing out of its self-assured and cool stranglehold over these representative foreign bodies, i.e., Cleopatra. Politics of empire. Antony and Cleopatra deals ambiguously with the politics of imperialism and colonization. Critics have long been invested in entangling the web of political implications that characterize the play. Interpretations of the work often rely on an understanding of Egypt and Rome as they respectively signify Elizabethan ideals of East and West, contributing to a long-standing conversation about the play's representation of the relationship between imperializing Western countries and colonized Eastern cultures. Through the lens of such a reading, the ascendancy of Rome over Egypt does not speak to the practice of empire building as much as it suggests the inevitable advantage of reason over sensuality. More contemporary scholarship on the play, however, has typically recognized the allure of Egypt for Antony and Cleopatra's audiences. Egypt's magnetism and seeming cultural primacy over Rome have been explained by efforts to contextualize the political implications of the play within its period of production. The various protagonists' ruling styles have been identified with rulers contemporary to Shakespeare. For example, there appears to be continuity between the character of Cleopatra and the historical figure of Queen Elizabeth I. The more recent influence of new historicism and post-colonial studies have yielded readings of Shakespeare that typified the play as subversive, or challenging the status quo of Western imperialism. The critic Abigail Scherer's claim that Shakespeare's Egypt is a holiday world. Empire and intertextuality. One of the ways to read the imperialist themes of the play is through a historical, political context with an eye for intertextuality. Many scholars suggest that Shakespeare possessed an extensive knowledge of the story of Antony and Cleopatra through the historian Plutarch, and used Plutarch's account as a blueprint for his own play. A closer look at this intertextual link reveals that Shakespeare used, for instance, Plutarch's assertion that Antony claimed a genealogy that led back to Hercules, and constructed a parallel to Cleopatra by often associating her with Dionysus in his play. Furthermore, because of the unlikelihood that Shakespeare would have had direct access to the Greek text of Plutarch's parallel lives and probably redid through a French translation from a Latin translation, he play constructs Romans with an anachronistic Christian sensibility that might have been influenced by St. Augustine's Confessions among others. As Miles writes, the ancient world would not have been aware of interiority and the contingents of salvation upon conscience until Augustine. For the Christian world, salvation relied on and belonged to the individual, while the Roman world viewed salvation as political. So, Shakespeare's characters in Antony and Cleopatra, particularly Cleopatra in her belief that her own suicide is an exercise of agency, exhibit a Christian understanding of salvation. Another example of deviance from the source material is how Shakespeare characterizes the rule of Antony and Cleopatra, while Plutarch singles out the order of exclusive society that the lovers surrounded themselves with, a society with a specifically defined and clear understanding of the hierarchies of power as determined by birth and status. Shakespeare's play seems more preoccupied with the power dynamics of pleasure as a main theme. Throughout the play, once pleasure has become a dynamic of power, then it permeates society and politics. Pleasure serves as a differentiating factor between Cleopatra and Antony, between Egypt and Rome, and can be read as the fatal flaw of the heroes if Antony and Cleopatra is a tragedy. For Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, the exclusivity and superiority supplied by pleasure created the disconnect between the ruler and the subjects. Critics suggest that Shakespeare did similar work with these sources in Othello, Julius Caesar, and Coriolanus. The happy ending of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra was never intended to be a tragedy. Instead, Shakespeare gave the illusion of the tragedy as the two protagonists set out to become the heroes of the play, and neither succeeded. Antony and Cleopatra are seen to have a passionate love for each other up till their demise, as both are seen ending their lives for the other. Although the couple was seen as a pair that could not live without the other, it does not take much to be able to point out that the basis of their relationship lies on manipulation and lust. Barbus was able to see this, as he never believed their love was true but instead a contradiction. Cleopatra always wanted Antony to be in the palm of her hands, to always be in control of his emotions, and would thus manipulate him by dancing whenever he was sad or fake a sickness if he were to be happy. This makes Antony only chase after Cleopatra even more in a never-ending cycle. They both try to be much more than they are and show their enemies and the world that they are invincible, rather than them sacrificing themselves for the other. The two protagonists set out to become the hero of the play and to show that being the last one standing, no hand will bring them down but their own. They did not die for love but for the fame that would come behind that sacrifice, and in the end, are seen as being noble and self-sacrificing. It does not end in a tragedy but in a bittersweet and almost happy ending. Both of the lovers' fates are interwoven, yet they deceive the other in a fight for dominance that Cleopatra wins for a while, as the audience and other characters throughout the play know completely what is going on in the play, filled with dramatic irony. Barbus once again knows of Antony's unrelenting attachment to Cleopatra and Cleopatra's mind games, while the audience knows Cleopatra isn't denied as Antony kills himself over her. They both spent their whole lives trying to achieve higher fame than the other and became notorious for their lust. They are their own gods and live separate from those that they call normal and watch. The play progresses into the protagonists' decline in fame, leaving them to pursue a sure way into that immortality they coveted. They become immortals in death along with even more fame, and has as well achieved their goal from the beginning. They die in the name of their love when they really die in the name of fame, a status of nobility higher than us, and pity for the tragedy that is their relationship. The tragedy is Antony and Cleopatra's own happy ending, as death was a small price to pay to become real gods. They proved that the only death that could touch them were by their own hand, further increasing that godly power they received from the people. Now they are apart from those they watched. Now they are above them. And now they will be worshipped as gods. Fortune and chance, politics and nature. The concept of luck, or fortune, is frequently referenced throughout Antony and Cleopatra, portrayed as an elaborate game that the characters participate in. An element of fate lies within the play's concept of chance. As the subject of fortune, chance's favor at any particular moment becomes the most successful character. Shakespeare represents fortune through elemental and astronomical imagery that recalls the character's awareness of the unreliability of the natural world. The play culminates, however, in Antony's realization that he is merely a card, not a player in this game. The motif of card-playing has a political undertone, as it relates to the nature of political dealings. Imagery frequently referred to throughout the play is thus intertwined with the political manipulation that each character incites. Yet the resulting winner of the political game relies in part on chance, which has a supreme quality that the characters cannot maintain control over, and therefore must submit to. Selected stage productions. 1947. Katharine Cornell won a Tony Award for her Broadway performance of Cleopatra opposite the Antony of Godfrey Torrell. It ran for 126 performances, the longest run of the play in Broadway history. 1951. Laurence Olivier as Antony and Vivian Lew as Cleopatra in a production that played in repertory, with George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra at the St. James's Theatre and later on Broadway. 1953. Michael Redgrave played Antony and Peggy Ashcroft played Cleopatra at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. 1972. Janet Sussman and Richard Johnson, with Patrick Stewart as Zeno Barbas in Trevor Nunn's production for the Royal Shakespeare Company. 1986. Timothy Dalton and Vanessa Redgrave in the title roles at CLWID Theatre Cymru and Haymarket Theatre. 1999. Alan Bates and Francis de la Torre in title roles. Guy Henry as Octavius, also David Oyelowo and Owen Oakeshott, at the Royal Shakespeare Company. 1999. Paul Shelley as Antony and Mark Rylance as Cleopatra in an all-male cast production at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. 2010. Kate Mulgrew and John Douglas Thompson in a production directed by Tina Landau at Hartford Stage. 2014. Eve Best and Clive Wood in the title roles at Shakespeare's Globe in London. Phil Daniels as Zeno Barbas. 2017. Josette Simon and Anthony Byrne in the title roles for the Royal Shakespeare Company's upcoming performance at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. Films and TV. Antony and Cleopatra, 1972, directed by and starring Charlton Heston as Antony, Hildegard Neal as Cleopatra and also featuring Eric Porter as Zeno Barbas. Antony and Cleopatra, 1974, a television production of Trevor Nunn's stage version performed by London's Royal Shakespeare Company. This version was shown in the United States to great acclaim in 1975. It stars Janet Sussman, Cleopatra, Richard Johnson, Antony, and Patrick Stewart. Zeno Barbas. Link to the video. Antony and Cleopatra, 1981, a TV production made as part of the BBC television Shakespeare series. It stars Colin Blakely, Antony, Jane Lapotaire, Cleopatra, and Ian Charleson. Link to the video. Antony and Cleopatra, a 1983 TV movie. It stars Timothy Dalton, Antony, and Lynn Redgrave, Cleopatra. Stage adaptations. John Fletcher and Philip Massinger's The False One, c.1620, was influenced by Shakespeare's play. John Dryden's play All for Love was deeply influenced by Shakespeare's treatment of the subject. Musical adaptations. feed, but she makes hungry, where most she satisfies. Quote, in Egypt, Cleopatra learns of Antony's marriage to Octavia and takes furious revenge upon the messenger that brings her the news. She grows content only when her courtiers assure her that Octavia is homely, short, low-browed, round-faced and with bad hair. Before battle, the triumvirs parley with Sextus Pompey, and offer him a truce. He can retain Sicily and Sardinia, but he must help them rid the sea of pirates and send them tributes. After some hesitation, Sextus agrees. They engage in a drunken celebration on Sextus' galley. Though the austere Octavius leaves early and sober from the party, Menes suggests to Sextus that he kill the three triumvirs and make himself ruler of the Roman Republic, but he refuses, finding it dishonorable. After Antony departs Rome for Athens, Octavius and Lepidus break their truce with Sextus and war against him. This is unapproved by Antony, and he is furious. Antony returns to Alexandria and crowns Cleopatra and himself as rulers of Egypt and the eastern third of the Roman Republic, which was Antony's share as one of the triumvirs. He accuses Octavius of not giving him his fair share of Sextus' lands, and is angry that Lepidus, whom Octavius has imprisoned, is out of the triumvirate. Octavius agrees to the former demand, but otherwise is very displeased with what Antony has done. In this Baroque vision, Battle of Actium by Lorenzo Castro, Cleopatra flees, lower left, in a barge with a figure-headed Fortuna. Antony prepares to battle Octavius. Barbus urges Antony to fight on land, where he has the advantage, instead of by sea, where the navy of Octavius is lighter, more mobile and better manned. Antony refuses, since Octavius has dared him to fight at sea. Cleopatra pledges her fleet to aid Antony. However, during the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece, Cleopatra flees with her 60 ships, and Antony follows her, leaving his forces to ruin. Ashamed of what he has done for the love of Cleopatra, Antony reproionic enough to provoke an audience almost to scorn. At the same time, Shakespeare invests her and Antony with tragic grandeur. These contradictory features have led to famously divided critical responses. It is difficult to classify Antony and Cleopatra as belonging to a single genre. It can be described as a history play, though it does not completely adhere to historical accounts. As a tragedy, though not completely in Aristotelian terms. As a comedy, as a romance, and according to some critics, e.g. McCarter, a problem play. All one can say with certainty is that it is a Roman play, even a sequel to another of Shakespeare's tragedies, Julius Caesar. Characters: Mark Antony, Roman general and one of the three joint leaders, or triumvirs, who ruled the Roman Republic after the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 B.C. Synopsis: Mark Antony, one of the triumvirs of the Roman Republic, along with Octavius and Lepidus, has neglected his soldierly duties after being beguiled by Egypt's queen, Cleopatra. He ignores Rome's domestic problems, including the fact that his third wife Fulvia rebelled against Octavius and then died. Octavius calls Antony back to Rome from Alexandria to help him fight against Sextus Pompey, Menecrates, and Menes, three notorious pirates of the Mediterranean. At Alexandria, Cleopatra begs Antony not to go, and though he repeatedly affirms his deep passionate love for her, he eventually leaves. The triumvirs meet in Rome, where Antony and Octavius put to rest, for now, their disagreements. Octavius's general, Agrippa, suggests that Antony should marry Octavius's sister, Octavia, in order to cement the friendly bond between the two men. Antony accepts. Antony's lieutenant Barbus, though, knows that Octavia can never satisfy him after Cleopatra. In a famous passage, he describes Cleopatra's charms. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they Antony and Cleopatra is a tragedy by William Shakespeare. The play was performed first circa 1607 at the Blackfriars Theatre or the Globe Theatre by the King's Men. Its first appearance in print was in the folio of 1623. The plot is based on Thomas North's translation of Plutarch's Lives and follows the relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony from the time of the Sicilian Revolt to Cleopatra's suicide during the final war of the Roman Republic. The major antagonist is Octavius Caesar, one of Antony's fellow triumvirs of the Second Triumvirate and the first emperor of the Roman Empire. The tragedy is mainly set in Roman Egypt, and is characterized by swift shifts in geographical location and linguistic register as it alternates between sensual, imaginative Alexandria and a more pragmatic, austere Rome. Many consider Shakespeare's Cleopatra, whom Antony describes as having infinite variety, as one of the most complex and fully developed female characters in the playwright's body of work. She is frequently vain and history